And look, I just have to be brutal about this when we cover a story like this. I've covered too many of them over the last 40 years. I think we have to deal with this country's baby killing problem. Because, and front page story on Stuff yesterday, well done, Jihan Quesada, for asking for the figures. And amazing yesterday, the figures in the last, I think, 7-8 years, 52 kids killed, died at the hands of their caregivers. 52 children, which is a problem. That's a baby killing problem. But the other amazing thing was the agencies involved didn't want to release those figures. They had them, and Jihan actually got hold of someone who leaked the figures to him and said, we've got them, we just don't want to talk about it. And I've got to say, it's not comfortable to admit that you live in a society where we're every, 8 weeks or so, bumping a child off with blunt force trauma, or throwing kids in tumble dryers and abusing them and leaving and neglecting them. It's not a cool thing to talk about. It doesn't get you a lot of votes. So I've got to say big ups to one MP who has stood up and spoken out on this. ACT MP Karen Chhour has really got into this issue, and I good on her. So she joins us now by video link. Karen, good to see you. I thank you very, very much indeed for your time this morning. I'm sorry, there is a frustrating predictability about the story of Ruthless Empire, isn't there? It's just like so many of the other stories we've heard over and over again.
Yeah, I have to be kind of careful with what I say today because it is an active case and I don't want to be looking like I'm interfering in the outcome of that case. But child abuse in general in this country is our national shame. We don't talk about it enough. And I went to Parliament because I felt that this issue just wasn't addressed enough. And we've got all these social issues later in life and we wonder why. It's because we're not actually doing the job at the right end. We're not funding the right end, and we're not making sure that our children get the best start in life.
There's also a predictability in this case. You find someone with a strange name. There's a gang affiliation, clearly. That has been reported as fact. And this child, and we know this, had been uplifted by Kāinga Ora and then handed back to a mother who'd already had either this child or another child uplifted. I'm sorry, Karen, how do we stop people like that breeding?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that stopping people breeding is kind of the language we should be using. I think we need to make sure that society understands their obligations when they do have a child and how vulnerable a young person actually is, and that they're not just kind of like an accessory. Because I think a lot of young people are looking, well, not even young people are looking for love in the wrong places sometimes, and having a child with this unconditional love towards you, I've found in some situations, is the reason that child's been born. Children are taking on responsibilities and taking on concerns that they really shouldn't be for their age. They should be innocent children that can wake up in the morning, feel safe, feel loved, and know that that day is going to be a good day. How we do that is quite complicated, and it's not an easy process. But somebody actually has to stand up and have an honest conversation about this and actually acknowledge that it is a problem, because unless you acknowledge that this is a problem, how can you solve it?
A really interesting perspective you've just given me is young people or kids have kids because they haven't got any love in their own life, and the intergenerationality of what we see here. I mean, we look at Ruthless Empire's mother. Her name is something, what was it, Storm or something? We look at her mother's name. That'll be something equally dickheady. So they look for love. They also look for money because we've monetised kids, haven't we? You have a kid, you get some money from the government. You're sweet. If you have no other employment prospects, it ups your benefit, doesn't it, Karen?
Yeah, I mean, there are some aspects to that, and I have spoken to some legislation that Labor did change in government around removing sanctions for having another child on a benefit and bringing them in line with a working mother with only having a year to get back to work, and that was changed by the Labor government. But I don't think that's necessarily the one cause of child abuse or neglect, because I just want to make this really clear. Abuse and neglect doesn't discriminate. It happens in many households. It happens in poor households. It happens in rich households. I think we have to be really careful that we're not just generalising.
Yeah, we do have to be careful,
like
Karen, but only a fool would not look at the last 20 or 30 years of child abuse in this country and say the majority of kids who have died have been Māori kids. I'm sorry, that's just a fact. Kahui twins, James Whakaruru. Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, no, I mean, and the nation weeps every time we hear a name, and I do understand that, but there's so many other kids where we'll never hear their names, and that's what really, really bothers me when I went into Parliament. We're not acknowledging that there's an actual problem. We're not acknowledging that society has become so, what would I say, desensitized to family violence and harm that it's kind of become acceptable. And we as a society need to actually stand up and say, no, it's not acceptable, and step up and actually say something. And I think we really have become desensitised to it. Now, there is a bill that I did speak to in Parliament, my bill, my member's bill that was pulled. Labor actually voted that down, and it was a bill that would remove a certain section within the Act that made race one of the contributing factors to decisions that were made around young people.
You've jumped the gun on me. That's where I was going to go next, because a lot of people would say cultural sensitivity gives, let's just get it out in the open, gives Māori, who are way overrepresented in killing their kids, makes it more difficult to uplift a Māori child than a child of any other ethnicity. It gives them extra protections, and it would seem it makes a rangatamariki reluctant to uplift when we've got all the liberal pearl-clutching journalists writing stories about colonialism and everything else. So you're saying you had a piece of legislation that would have stopped that political claptrap, stopping the protection of babies, or what protection uplift might provide?
Well, it didn't necessarily provide protection of child abusers. That's not what it did. But what it did do...
Sorry, but of children, I'm saying. Yeah.
To some extent, what you're saying, I understand, because when you're having to look at a child, and rather than looking at that child and what they need and making sure that their best interests are at the heart of your decision, you're also having to take into account their ethnicity. And I think you are right. It's not fair on some really good social workers that might have made a different decision if that piece of legislation hadn't have been there. So, this is an important piece of legislation for me, the removal of Section 7AA. Some say that I'm racist for putting this bill forward. But my argument is that a Māori child deserves the same protection as any other child in this country. And if this piece of legislation is actually doing more harm than good, why are we keeping it? Because we need to make sure that these young people are in safe, loving homes, whether that be with their family, if that's the right place to be, or whether that be with somebody who is willing to give that child the love they deserve.